You've heard of Sparta, the spears, the shields, the warriors who never feared death, the 300 who stood against the Persian horde, the discipline, the glory, the legend. But what if I told you that story, the one you've seen on movie screens, read in textbooks, whispered in classrooms, was only half of the truth? Beneath every bronze helmet, beneath every statue of a proud, oiled soldier, was a silent figure in the dirt, bent, barefoot, and unseen. They were called the Helots, and without them, Sparta would have crumbled like sand under its own boots. You see, Sparta wasn't just a warrior state, it was a machine, a perfectly tuned engine of dominance. And like all engines, someone had to keep it running. That someone wasn't Leonidas. It wasn't the brave men who screamed Molon Labe. It wasn't the boys trained in the Agog, throwing javelins since the age of 7. No, it was the Helot, the one who farmed the land while the warrior trained, the one who carried the harvest while his master lifted swords, the one who bled quietly, invisibly, so that Sparta could rise. But their names forgotten, their faces erased, their stories never told. Tonight, we begin to tell one, not of kings, not of heroes, but of the ones who stood just behind them, in shadow. Imagine this: a Spartan child wakes in silk sheets. He stretches, yawns, and walks into a warm courtyard where a meal waits: olives, figs, warm bread. But he didn't cook it. He didn't even know who did. Because somewhere before the sun rose, a Helot woman woke in the cold, bent over the fire, and placed every fig on that plate. She won't speak unless spoken to. She won't make eye contact. She won't leave without permission. Her child is not allowed to learn letters, not allowed to own anything, not allowed to hope, because hope is dangerous. In the shining world of Sparta, Helots were considered less than human necessary, but disposable. And yet, they were the backbone of it all. They outnumbered the Spartans, sometimes 7-1. Imagine that. A ruling class so small, surviving only by crushing the masses beneath it with fear, tradition, and blood. To be a Helot wasn't just to be enslaved. It was to be ritually reminded every year that you were less. During the festival of the Krypteia, Spartan teenagers were sent into the night, knives in hand, to hunt Helots, not criminals, not rebels, just whoever looked too strong, too healthy, too proud. It was training for the boys. It was terror for the Helots. And it was Sparta's way of making sure no one ever rose high enough to hope. We begin our journey here beneath the polished armor. We look down into the dirt and finally ask, who built Sparta and what did it cost them? Let's step into the world not of warriors, but of their shadows. Who were they really? Not just the word Helot, not just a label tucked inside a history book, but the people, the blood, the breath, the heartbeat behind the Spartan state. Because to understand the Helots, you have to forget everything you know about slavery. They weren't shackled to a post. They weren't auctioned in a marketplace. They weren't branded with hot iron or sold across the sea. The Helots were something stranger. They were a people enslaved not by individuals, but by a state. They were bound not to a master, but to a system, a cold, bureaucratic, emotionless machine that knew exactly how much they produced and exactly how much fear it took to keep them compliant. You see, the Helots weren't foreigners. They weren't outsiders dragged in from distant lands. They were locals, natives, the original inhabitants of the land Sparta now called its own. Long before the Spartans rose to power, long before they carved their name into history. The region of Laconia was home to free tribes farmers, shepherds, thinkers who lived quiet lives under quiet skies. And then the Spartans came, not with treaties, not with alliances, but with fire and swords. They conquered, and when they were done conquering, they didn't exile the people. They didn't wipe them out. No, they turned them into helots. It was a slavery by inheritance. If your parents were helots, so were you. If you tried to escape, you were hunted. If you resisted, you were made an example. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Unlike other slave systems where the enslaved were seen as property objects to be owned, the helots were technically state serfs. They lived in their own villages, had families, even kept a portion of what they grew. But every season, they were forced to give the majority of their harvest to a Spartan overlord. They weren't permitted to travel, or speak in public, or train, or gather. And worst of all, they were never allowed to forget who they were or what they weren't. There was a ceremony each year, a formal, state-sanctioned declaration of war on the helots. Not metaphorically, literally. Every year, the Spartan government would declare war on its own slave population. Why? Because if you were at war, killing helots wasn't murder. It was policy. The message was clear. We don't just own you. We fear you. And we will remind you of that every year. It's a chilling arrangement, one that functioned not just on labor, but on humiliation. Helots were often forced to get drunk in front of Spartan children as examples of how not to behave. They were paraded, mocked, beaten, all for the sake of education. And yet, they endured for centuries, generation after generation, not because they loved their role, not because they were weak, but because the system was built to crush resistance before it ever had a chance to rise. It wasn't just physical oppression. It was psychological warfare, codified, cultural, cemented in every corner of Spartan life. You might be wondering, how did the rest of Greece allow this? The truth is, they didn't talk about it. The helots were invisible to history, rarely mentioned in great works, never given names, never granted stories. They were ghosts in the chronicles of war, whispers behind the glory, and until now, they were forgotten. But today, we remember. We speak their name. We break the silence. And we ask, again, who were the helots? They were the people Sparta could not live without, and the people it would never fully accept as human. Wake up before the sun, before the birds, because if you're a helot, the day doesn't belong to you. Nothing does. Not the food in your bowl, not the roof above your head, not even the thoughts in your mind if they're dangerous enough. You rise in silence because silence is safer. Your hands ache before they touch anything. Your back remembers yesterday, and your stomach knows better than to hope for fullness. You step outside into a village that looks like freedom, but isn't. There are no chains, no whips, no visible walls. Just rules, unspoken, unbreakable, unending. You know how much wheat to hand over. You know who not to look at. You know that running means death, and talking too much might mean worse. That's life. If you're a helot, you work the land, but you don't own a single grain. You build the house, but the floor doesn't remember your name. You raise children, but you teach them caution, not dreams. And yet, in the quiet, sometimes you wonder, what if I kept a little more? What if I spoke up? What if I left? But those thoughts don't last long. Not here, not in Sparta. Because Sparta doesn't just break bodies. It conditions minds. You see, this wasn't a society of open cruelty. It was far more efficient than that. It was a system designed to erase the very idea of ownership of self. The helot had no legal identity, no recourse, no path to freedom, no version of tomorrow where things got better. There were no dates circled on the calendar. No, after this harvest, or once my child grows up. Only today. And today looked very much like yesterday. The Spartan system was precise, mathematically so. Each helot village was assigned quotas, exact amounts of grain, oil, livestock, every month, without fail. If they produced more, they couldn't keep it. If they produced less, there were punishments, public and permanent. And while they toiled, Spartan boys trained. They learned war. They learned silence. They learned that their safety, their very lives, depended on keeping the helots afraid. It wasn't just labor. It was theater. A carefully choreographed performance where the helots always played the part of the grateful slave. Even laughter was risky. Too much happiness might look suspicious, might look like rebellion. So they smiled carefully, quietly, if at all. And love it existed. Of course it did. In whispers, in hurried touches behind huts, in a flower tucked behind the ear, in a piece of bread saved for a child. But love was dangerous because love made you dream, and dreams, well, those didn't belong to you either. Not if you were a helot. The tragedy wasn't just how hard they worked. It was how much they gave without ever being allowed to believe that anything they touched was truly theirs. They lived in a world where being alive was a duty, but existing was a risk they took every single day. And so we ask, what does it mean to live without ownership, not just of property, but of time, of voice, of name? It means you survive, but survival is the lowest bar. The helots weren't just made to serve. They were made to disappear. But tonight we look for them, in footprints that never made it into history books, in broken tools buried beneath palaces, in echoes between fields now long forgotten. Because a life without ownership is still a life, and it deserves to be told. Imagine this. You are 17. A Spartan boy. You have trained your whole life in the agage, in pain, in silence. You've learned to steal without being caught. You've learned to speak only when necessary. You've been beaten for hesitating, punished for weakness, rewarded for cruelty. And now it is time. Not to go to war, not yet. Your first test is to kill a man, unarmed, unaware, asleep. But this man isn't a foreign soldier. He isn't an enemy general. He isn't even a criminal. He's a helot. Maybe you've seen him before, working the fields, hauling grain to your mother's house, bowing his head when you pass. But tonight, you are not a boy. Tonight, you are Cryptia. The Cryptia was not a myth. It was real. A state-sanctioned shadow army made up of Spartan teenagers, young men chosen not for strength, but for silence, for loyalty, for their ability to kill without hesitation and without remorse. And their targets, helots. Not just any helots, but the ones who looked too strong, too organized, too confident. Sparta was afraid of rebellion, always, and rather than wait for it, they struck first. The Cryptia operated under the cover of darkness. No armor, no insignia, only knives and orders. Orders to stalk, to watch, to strike when no one was looking, to disappear without a sound. Some called it training, others called it terror. For the helots, it was a living nightmare. Imagine tending your crops during the day, then spending the night wondering if footsteps outside your door meant the end. You wouldn't fight back, because no one would help you, because no one would even admit it happened. The murders weren't recorded. There were no funerals, only silence and fear. The purpose of the crypteia wasn't just death, it was psychological domination. If the helots feared each other, if they feared their own shadows, they would never unite. Divide, distract, dismantle. That was the logic. But here's the most chilling part. This wasn't just for the helots. The crypteia was a test for the Spartans, too. A rite of passage, a way to separate boys from warriors, to see who was ready to enforce the system without question. It turned children into killers, and then turned those killers into leaders. What kind of society does that? One built on control, on fear, on silence. The helots had no defense, no warning, no justice. A young man could enter your village one night and decide your fate based on how confident you looked while walking home. Imagine living under that. Not just as a possibility, but as an annual ritual. It didn't happen once. It happened every year. And every year, helots disappeared. No explanation, no trial, no burial. Just absence and silence. That was the crypteia. Not a legend, not a rumor, a policy, and perhaps the most disturbing proof that Sparta feared its slaves more than it loved its ideals. What happens when loyalty isn't rewarded, but punished? What if devotion isn't a shield, but a target? The helots learned this lesson again and again in blood. You see, not all helots were defiant. Not all plotted revolt. Many simply wanted to survive, to serve, to feed their families, to stay alive. And some, a rare few, became trusted. They cooked for Spartan generals. They raised Spartan children. They marched beside Spartan soldiers in war. Some even fought. Yes, there were helots who took up arms to protect the very state that enslaved them. They bled for Sparta. They died for Sparta. And what did they get? Not gratitude. Not citizenship. Not even safety. They got silence, and often they got death, because in Sparta, a loyal helot was not a good sign. It was a dangerous one. Imagine this. You are a helot man. You've served your master for 20 years. You know his routines. You help him train. He trusts you. One day, you are sent with him to the battlefield. You carry the rations, the shields. You fight beside him when arrows rain. You survive. He survives. You return to Sparta, and then a few weeks later you disappear. Why? Because now you're respected. You've proven yourself strong, capable, loyal, and that makes you a threat. It's a cruel irony. In most societies, loyalty is currency. It buys safety, reputation, sometimes even freedom. But in Sparta, it only bought suspicion. There are recorded cases scattered, sparse of helots who were promised freedom after exemplary service. But when the time came, they vanished. Some were quietly executed. Others were freed, only to be killed days later. No ceremony, no justice, just removal. You see, Sparta had no room for hopeful slaves. A helot who fought too well, who spoke too clearly, who inspired others, was a liability. Because the system didn't want strong helots, it wanted controlled ones. And loyalty was unpredictable. So it was safer to erase it. Let's look at one story. According to ancient sources, during a particularly brutal campaign, a group of helots fought valiantly on the front lines. They were promised freedom. In a rare public ceremony, they were crowned with garlands, celebrated, paraded before the people, and then they were taken away and killed. All of them. Why? Because the celebration wasn't real. It was a trap, a way to identify which helots were brave, which ones could become leaders, which ones believed they could be more than slaves. Sparta didn't fear rebellion. It feared inspiration, and inspiration often comes from loyalty. The Helot who stands tall beside a Spartan, who survives battle, who smiles at the crowd. He's not dangerous because he's disloyal. He's dangerous because he still believes he might belong. And in a system built on total separation, belonging was the greatest threat of all. So what did the Helots learn? They learned that loyalty meant nothing. That survival required not just obedience, but invisibility. That the price of trust was often death, and that no matter how hard they tried, they would never be Spartan. Not truly, not safely, not even for a moment. Because to be trusted was to be watched, and to be loyal was to be at risk. How long can you be stepped on before you start to push back? How long can you bury your voice before it claws its way to the surface? The Helots may have been silenced, but they were never blind, never deaf, never dumb. They saw the system for what it was, and they remembered. Because memory, that quiet, unkillable ember, is dangerous. Yes, the Helots revolted, not often, not loudly, but they did, and when they did, Sparta trembled. You might imagine the Spartans as fearless, unshakable, but behind the walls of stone, beneath the bravado and bronze, they were afraid of the people they owned, afraid of the hands that tilled their soil, fed their children, and slept just beyond the torchlight. Let's talk about one revolt. It happened after a massive earthquake, a natural disaster that tore through the region. Homes crumbled, temples fell, and for one brief, terrifying moment, Sparta was vulnerable. The Helots seized it. With nothing to lose, they rose in numbers, in fury, in hunger for something more. They struck at the weakened Spartans, took control of parts of the countryside, and fortified themselves in the mountains. It wasn't a full revolution, but it was a warning. It took years for Sparta to suppress it. Years of skirmishes, sieges, bargaining, and blood. And then Sparta did something unexpected. They asked for help from Athens, their rival. Why? Because the fear was too great. The Helots were too many, too angry, too close. Athens sent aid, and then, according to some sources, Sparta sent them away. Why? Because even their allies might be tempted to side with the oppressed once they saw the truth. This wasn't just rebellion. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to the face of Sparta that showed what they really were, outnumbered. There were other revolts, too, smaller, quieter. Some were nothing more than tools broken on purpose. Food withheld. Rumors spread. Others were ambushes, assassinations, disappearances. But none were allowed to last. Sparta crushed them with precision, with violence, with ritual. For every act of resistance, there was a punishment 3 times worse. Entire families erased, villages burned, warnings etched into walls with blood. And still the embers remained, because no matter how complete the control, you cannot conquer memory. You cannot outlaw hope. So why weren't there more revolts? Why didn't the Helots rise en masse, sweep Sparta from its pedestal, and claim their lives back? The answer is chilling in its simplicity. Fear works. Generation after generation was raised not just in chains, but in habits. Fear passed down like a family recipe. Rules memorized like prayers, and pain accepted as life itself. Many Helots didn't imagine freedom. They imagined survival, and even that was uncertain. To rebel was to risk everything: yourself, your children, your entire village. And when the consequences are designed to be worse than death, most people don't gamble. But the revolts, as rare as they were, proved something. The Helots weren't brainwashed. They weren't weak. They were trapped. And still, some dared to fight, to scream, to strike, to run. Their stories are mostly lost, burned, buried, erased. But tonight, we unearth them. We speak for them. Because even forbidden revolts leave behind whispers of fire. Sparta, the land of warriors, of discipline, of undying glory. That's the story they told the world. That's the image they carved in stone. That's the myth that echoed through history. But here's the truth they didn't like to say out loud. Sparta didn't stand on strength. It stood on the backs of helots. Think about it. Spartan citizens didn't farm, didn't cook, didn't clean, didn't build roads, carry water, or raise livestock. They trained, they fought, they ruled. And to do that, someone else had to do everything else. That someone was always a helot. They worked the land producing the grain that kept Spartan stomachs full. They maintained the homes so warriors could rest before battle. They raised children not their own, but Spartan children destined to become soldiers. They followed armies into war carrying supplies, cooking meals, treating wounds. They were the invisible engine of Sparta, uncredited, unthanked, unfree. This wasn't an accident. It was by design. The Spartan state intentionally built a system where all leisure, training, and military dominance was made possible by an enslaved class beneath it. The Spartans didn't just tolerate this dependence, they needed it to maintain their way of life. Without the helots, there would be no Spartan warriors, no fearsome army, no tales of Thermopylae. Because if a Spartan had to farm, he couldn't train. If he had to build, he couldn't fight. Sparta's elite status was funded by forced labor, and they knew it. That's why they controlled the helots so aggressively. That's why they declared war on them every year. That's why they never allowed upward mobility. That's why loyalty meant nothing. Because to keep the helots working, they had to keep them afraid. Now, here's the question no one wants to ask. If the system depends on fear, is it strong or is it fragile? Sparta projected invincibility, but underneath, there was always terror. Not from Persia, not from Athens, but from within. They feared the helots would rise. They feared they'd refuse. They feared the mirror that showed just how dependent they truly were. Because if your empire crumbles the moment the oppressed stop cooperating, was it really an empire? Or just a well-maintained illusion? Historians sometimes call Sparta a society of warriors, but that's only half the sentence. The other half, built on the suffering of others. It wasn't just militarized, it was stratified. One class trained to fight, the other trained to obey. And obedience was never earned, only enforced. The helots didn't choose this. They weren't born to serve. They were forced to carry a state that denied their humanity while relying on their labor for survival. Sparta needed them. More than food, more than shields, more than legends. They were the quiet heartbeat of the city-state. And yet they were never honored, never protected, never remembered. Until now. Now we see them. Not as background, not as footnotes, but as the reason Sparta stood as long as it did. Because history is never as clean as we'd like it to be. And sometimes the greatest civilizations owe everything to those they tried hardest to forget. Chains are obvious, whips leave scars. But the most powerful kind of slavery is the one that doesn't need either. It's not forged in iron. It's forged in thought, in repetition, in ritual. The Spartans didn't just enslave the helots physically. They created a system of belief so deeply rooted. Even the helots began to believe it themselves. It began early. Children born into helot families were taught not just to obey, but to feel less, not less fortunate, less human. They were told not to speak loudly, not to look Spartans in the eye, not to sing proud songs, not to celebrate too much, laugh too loudly, stand too tall. Modesty wasn't a virtue, it was a survival tactic. Because visibility was danger, confidence was rebellion. So helots learned to shrink themselves long before they ever learned to walk in full stride. Then came the rituals. Every year, as part of state tradition, Spartan citizens performed ceremonies meant to reaffirm their dominance and the helots' place beneath them. One such ritual forcing helots to get drunk and dance foolishly in front of Spartan children. It wasn't just entertainment, it was indoctrination. The children would laugh, the elders would nod, and the helots would act as the punchline, their dignity offered up like meat to wolves. It taught the Spartans one thing: you are better, and taught the helots something else: you are not. This wasn't punishment, it was tradition, a mechanism so subtle, so normalized, that even outside observers would sometimes describe it as cultural. But behind the customs was a calculated goal: domestication. Turn revolt into shame, turn memory into silence, turn history into absence. And like any belief system, it came with its own language. Helots didn't call themselves slaves. They were simply what they were. Spartans didn't call it oppression. It was order, balance, the way of things. Even the words conspired to erase the crime. Now, imagine being born into that, never being told you're less because no one needed to say it anymore. It was in the way they looked at you, the way they didn't. It was in the law, but more importantly, it was in the air. And perhaps worst of all, it worked. Some helots believed. They bowed not out of fear, but habit. They accepted not out of weakness, but exhaustion. After generations of the same script, some stopped reading and started reciting. That's the most terrifying part of psychological slavery, when the enslaved begin to police themselves. When rebellion feels unnatural, when freedom feels like fiction, when the mind becomes the cage and the key is long forgotten. So how do you fight that? You can break chains, you can escape walls. But how do you unlearn a lifetime of rituals? How do you teach a child born in submission that he is worthy? How do you heal wounds when no one ever told you were bleeding? That was the true genius of Sparta's system. Its cruelty wasn't loud. It was ritualized, normalized, polished into tradition. The Spartans ruled with the sword, yes, but they also ruled with ceremony, with silence, with shame. And the helots, they lived under it, inside it, sometimes even as it. History remembers warriors. It builds statues of kings. It carves names into stone names of the victorious, the powerful, the loud. But what about the others? What about the ones who built the floors of those palaces? The ones who bled into the soil while others raised their flags? The ones who had no last names, because they were never meant to be remembered? The helots. You might ask if this system was so brutal, so calculated, so deeply embedded into Spartan society. Why don't we hear more about it? Why isn't it in textbooks? Why don't movies mention it? Why is it always a side note, a shadow trailing behind the legend? The answer is uncomfortable because people chose not to look. Even in the ancient world, writers spoke of Sparta with awe, admiration, even envy. Plato, Xenophon, they praised the discipline, the order, the bravery. They saw the sharp lines, the war formations, the perfect silence, and mistook it for virtue. What they didn't see or didn't want to was what held it all up: the fear, the blood, the bodies. Helots were mentioned, yes, but always vaguely, as background noise, as context, never as people, never as central. Because to tell their story was to stain the illusion, to complicate the myth. And so, history blinked. It recorded the battles, the kings, the defeats, and victories. But the daily violence, the systemic humiliation, the cultural erasure, that was left out, omitted not by accident, but by choice. Even modern historians have struggled to bring the Helots forward. Why? Because there's so little left. No Helot writings, no monuments, no first-person accounts. Their story exists in fragments, descriptions written by those who oppressed them, biased, filtered, incomplete. Trying to understand the Helots is like listening for whispers in a burning room. But that doesn't mean we stop listening. It means we listen harder. Because the fact that their story was buried is part of the story itself. This isn't just about history. It's about how we tell it. Who gets to speak? Who gets remembered? And who gets edited out? The Helots were edited out on purpose, because remembering them means rethinking Sparta. It means admitting that greatness built on suffering isn't greatness at all. It means letting go of the clean lines and sharp spears and looking into the dirt where the real foundation was laid. So what do? We name them. We imagine their lives. We put flesh on the ghosts. We tell the story that was never meant to be told. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. Because history isn't just about glory. It's about justice. And sometimes the greatest act of justice is simply to say, they were here. We speak of glory as if it's clean, shining, polished in gold and marble. But sometimes glory is heavy, sticky, built from things we don't want to look at too closely. Sparta was glorious, unquestionably. Its warriors were fierce, its discipline unmatched, its name immortalized. But all of that came with a cost, not in silver, not in marble, but in the lives of thousands who were never meant to be remembered. The Helots, they were the scaffolding, the frame hidden behind the painting, the soil under the temple, and they were never invited to stand in the sunlight they made possible. Ask yourself, what is glory if it rests on suffering? What is discipline if it requires erasure? What is power if it demands silence? And can a civilization be truly great if it fears the very people who keep it alive? The Helots never had a voice, not because they had nothing to say, but because no one listened. And that silence became part of the myth, a myth so clean, so convenient, so heroic, that we forgot to ask what it was hiding. We remembered the 300, but we forgot the 3,000 who dug their graves. We praised the perfect order of Sparta, but ignored the fear it was built to contain. We romanticized their strength, but never questioned their shame. But now, you've heard the story. You've seen what was buried beneath the bronze. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You begin to recognize the pattern. Because the story of the Helots is not just about Sparta. It's about every system that hides its foundations, every nation that writes history from the top down, every myth built on someone else's silence. The Helots lived in fear, but they also lived in hope. Hope whispered in alleys, planted between stones, passed like seeds through calloused hands. And though their names were never etched in stone, their lives shaped a world that tried to pretend they never existed. So what, then, is the price of glory? It is this: to look beyond the statue and see the shadow that cast it, to honor not just the conquerors but the hands that held up their swords, to admit that greatness, unexamined, can become a lie, and to remember the Helots not as slaves, but as people, as fathers, mothers, daughters, sons, human beings who lived, breathed, loved, and endured, even when the world refused to see them. You've heard the silence now, not just the facts, but the spaces between them, the quiet weight of what was left out, the names never written, the hands never praised, the breath that carried an empire, but was never heard. Tonight, you walked through the dust beneath the statues. You stood where the sun didn't reach. And you listened. And in doing so, you've remembered those the world forgot. That is no small thing, because to remember is an act of resistance. To reflect is a kind of healing. And as you lie down now, as your body slows, your breath softens, and the world quiets around you, know that you carry more than just stories. You carry echoes. You carry memory. You carry empathy, the kind that builds a different kind of history, one that feels, one that sees, one that questions. So let this be a resting place for your mind, for your heart, and for all those who came before, never knowing if anyone would ever speak their names aloud again. You did, and that matters. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may tomorrow greet you gently with eyes a little more open than the day before.